welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today and bearing with me with my hoarse voice here. Um, my name is Michael. I've been volunteering at the museum for quite a few years, not as long as Patty Steele, our bookkeeper. And anyway, I'm on the board now, and it's been a real experience for me to participate in this historical institution. And part of what happens today, what I'm going to talk about, is an experience that I had and Judy Lynn had with some of the northern Indians that came to visit us in 2014. So that'll be sort of like the end of my story and presentation. I want to start out by, we were talking about this the other day, of things that we needed to do in the museum as time went on, looking to the future. And the first thing that came to mind was for me to say, I want to tell a story. And so you're going to be hearing a lot more stories, I hope, over the years of local history, maybe even getting together with Judy and talking about some of the stories you did on all those oral histories that you did, many, and other stories besides the story of Captain Ebey, which is probably our obviously most notorious story. It's a little strange, I mean, to have our notorious story to be such a grisly story, but it did happen, and there are all sorts of reasons and build up to what happened, and I'm going to try to fill you all in on that today. Colonel Isaac Ebey had an encounter with the northern Indians, and in that encounter he lost his life, and that was in 1857. The build up to that, the reason why all of that happened was because of our relationship here and the relationship to the Indians in the north, mostly in southern Alaska. And who were the northern Indians exactly? Well, all the stories we hear are about, they were the Haida, who lived in the Queen Charlotte Islands. And in this case, the historical tradition was wrong. It really wasn't the Haida. There may have been a few Haida there that day, but it was mostly a visitation from the northernmost group of those Alaska Coast Indians called the Tlingit. I always thought it was T-L-Tla, but even though it's spelled T-L-A, Tla, it's K, it's a K sound. And that's what I read, correcting us all. So anyway, you'll know what I mean. They were from the village of Cake, and that was a subgroup within the Tlingit tribe. Also, some of the northern Indians were the Bella Bella, the Kwakwakawakwa, which has taken me years to do that, Bella Kula, and of course the Tlingit. These were the sort of, I guess you'd say, high art cultures of the coast of Alaska. The panhandle that goes down the coast next to British Columbia. These were the totem pole Indians. They were part of the same cultural area of the Salish people who lived here, but the Salish people did not have the totem pole tradition that the northern tribes did. The totem poles here are much shorter. I'm not even sure they call them totem. I think they call them story poles. And they're smaller and they tell a story, whereas the totem poles are the totem and clan heraldry of the people who live in that house. And your houses are huge. If you've probably been to some of the museums up in Canada and so forth. They were made of wood planks, massive things. A number of families could live within those dwellings, and they were huge compared to like the Salish people here in our area here where we are right now on one of the Salish villages right where we're sitting right now. They had very large canoes that would, make our canoes in our basement look small. And they were warrior cultures. They really, what we would probably call today, really badass. And they were feared and by all of the tribes around them. This is the Tlingit I'm talking about, Tlingit. And especially the Salish people who lived in this area. The way of life was built on slavery, which was interesting because in the South at that time in the United States, the Southern culture was built on slavery. So it was slavery there and slavery here. And they would come down and they would kidnap people from this area, the Salish people, or people from other tribes even up in Alaska. And the people here too, the Salish people who lived here in Coopville, were also kept slaves. They were not as big into the slave culture as the Northern Indians were, and probably that's the reason why the Northern Indians were able to have the time to create all of those big, huge, wonderful totem poles. When you have slaves doing all of the grunt work, when you have them going out to fish and to bring in the food, go collect the water and the whatever, you have to have spare time to do that. And so creating a huge totem pole took a lot of energy. And so the slaves did the work and the people in the culture, the tribe, did the artwork. And it was a class society. There was the nobility, the people that right under them, and then there were the slaves. So it's a much different culture than we were used to, and that certainly the settlers that were here, the European settlers were here, did not understand. And some did because they got to know them personally, but a lot of it is they did not understand what they were dealing with. The northern cultures, again talking about the Tlingit, had an imperious outlook on the rest of the world. They were sort of like the top of the food chain. They were top dog in the whole northwest coast from southern Alaska all the way down to Oregon. And they did that by warfare. They would visit, they would come down into canoes, and mind you, the Tlingits had to come 1,000 miles from their homeland down to Whidbey Island. So that's a 2,000-mile journey down and back. And it's amazing what these canoes, these cedar canoes, were and what they did, and who they carried and all of the goods that they carried. Sometimes they would come down and spend the whole summer here in the area. Some of them came to maraud, to steal, to take captives. Some of them, however, came to actually work in the sawmills over on the Kitsap Peninsula. And so it was like you had an individual relationship with somebody from the north. It didn't always mean that he was here for bad reasons. Again, that's a cultural judgment. The reputation that they had was that they would work, they would come down, they would fish, hunt, they would work in the mill, and then at the end of the summer they would go back. And that period at the end of the summer was very crucial because that was when they retired from working the summer and they go out and drink, get drunk, and they would cause trouble. And cause trouble meaning they would get in fights with people, they would come into the towns and steal stuff and so forth, so that the Europeans, we were very afraid of them. And so mostly, and they treated all of the native people here with some sort of deference, because in the very beginning we were outnumbered by the native population, big time. And that eventually changed, obviously. But in the beginning especially, you had to keep on good terms with your neighbors, the native folks. And it was the same way with the northern people. They would come down and they would demand this and demand that, and so you'd have to negotiate. And so it would be a way of getting along. You can only go so far, obviously, but at the same time you tried to meet them halfway. The settler opinion of the northern people was not very good. Other than the fear, they had little respect for them. One of the quotes I read in some of the literature was that they delighted in war, rape, and murder. Now, that's all kind of relative. The Trail of Tears was also going on the other side of the United States. The natives were being disenfranchised from their land. So I mean, I have to keep remembering that. And I'm not excusing them at all. Certainly what happened to Colonel Ebey was horrific. But it's a culture that we did not understand. And they had rules about if you kill somebody, you have to have compensation. The family would work out a bunch of bartering goods. Or if you killed the chief, you didn't work out good, you went and killed the chief on the other side. That's the way they kept their world together. Killing a chief was better than the whole village moving out and going over to the other village and wiping them all out. So it was a way of keeping the balance to keep war down among the tribes. If you remember, the Chimacum over in the other side in Kitsap Peninsula were attacked by Chief Seattle and his Duwamish people. And they were pretty much wiped out by good old Chief Seattle. And that was part of their culture. And the land was divided between the various Salish tribes. So who was Captain Isaac Nathan Ebey? He was a customs collector, a lawyer by training, and he was the prosecuting attorney for the Island County and for Thurston County. And Thurston County at that time took in Olympia, King County, Jefferson County. It was huge. And so he was a lot of times off of the island because he had education as a lawyer and his skills were needed in the very early times. He was also the very first settler, European settler, on Whidbey Island. He built a home right behind where the Ferri house stands now. And he had a 640-acre land, donation land claim, which the government offered land to any settler who 640 acres was for two people. Anytime they would go and farm the land and develop it for 5 years, and after that time it was yours, and you didn't have to pay anything. They grew, Colonel Ebey grew wheat, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, parsnips, peas, barley, and other grains. So he was basically a farmer, gentleman farmer. Well, not gentleman farmer, I guess you'd have to say a hard-working farmer. And he came from Missouri, encouraged his family and his wife, Rebecca, his first wife, Rebecca's family, to come on out here to Whidbey and join him because the land was so beautiful and it was so, the ground was so fertile. And even after a few years, I think the Whidbey Island had some of the highest results in the wheat crop across the whole nation. It wasn't just here. He was a very important personage in the area, and he was seen as a future candidate for governor. So he had a reputation well beyond Whidbey. And he got his colonel title because during the 1855 and 56 Yakima War, he raised a group of volunteers to go over there and fight here from Whidbey. Though I never could find any record of what their exactly role was in the war, but he was granted the title of colonel. Now as 1855 and 56 approach, the Yakima War ended, 1856. The settlers in our area were panicking about the northern Indians coming and their incursions. They were reported to have caused trouble and stealing and just scaring people a lot in Whatcom, Steelicum, Nisqually, Port Gamble, and Port Townsend. A number of Sklallam who live over in the Kitsap Peninsula, who lived at Port Gamble and also further south, they'd actually been reports of murder of some of their people. So that kind of fear just sort of seeped into the community all here in the Salish Sea. They would come down and raid, they would get the slaves, they would plunder, they would go to the reservations where some of the Salish had been placed, and they plundered the potato crops and they robbed their dwellings. In 1856, over in Port Gamble, which is sort of a little bit south and east of Port Townsend, over the other side, a flotilla of Tlingit canoes came down from Alaska, carrying about 100 plus people. And attacks in the Nisqually started going up, and 2 men and a child had been murdered. So again, it was a scary period, and here are more examples of things that people were hearing about. Even though there was no telegraph or whatever, people were communicating by boat, going around from the various settlements, so the word spread fairly quickly. They went to a cooperage, and the cooperage is the place where they make barrels with the slats and the ground iron hoop. They ransacked that, and they stole the cooper's all of his tools. The northern Indians were able to, they did metal work with copper, but then as time went on, more and more contact with the whites, they actually some of them became blacksmiths. Or they went to tribes and kidnapped a blacksmith, a man who might have known blacksmith, and then he was a prized slave, and so he was, very considered a big accomplishment for them. So they had metal to a point. It was a small boat near Seattle that two non-native men were in, and they were attacked by the northern Indians. One of them was killed, the other one was able to get away, and he sounded the alarm. Again, another rise in fear and panic in the community. The newspapers at the time were full of letters to the editor demanding that the government step in and protect the community from the northern Indians. The schooner Massachusetts USS Massachusetts was dispatched, and they were searching for this band of Tlingit that were roaming around the Salish Sea. And they found them over at Port Gamble. And they had camped across the bay, just right on the edge of the water. A man named, and I'm going to have to always try to look at this one, Captain Swartwout. That's a good old German name, I'm assuming, but it doesn't roll off my tongue too well. Captain Swartwout of the schooner Massachusetts, he landed 2 groups of Marines on the beach there, and they kind of surrounded they didn't actually totally surround it, but they had 2 positions to attack the raiders. He demanded that they withdraw, and that they surrender the people guilty of killing the man in the boat near Seattle, and of all the thefts that had been going on in Port Gamble. They'd been there, and they would come in at night and pilfer and break into houses and everything. And the natives refused. They said, this is our, territory, whatever. We're not used to they didn't take orders from anybody. And so they were fired upon by Captain Swartwout. And he had a brass howitzer and a mortar. Now, I have no idea what they looked like in those days, but they were small compared to what a ship would have on them, but they obviously were effective in what they needed to do. They think they were camped on the beach. The guns started going off, the howitzer and so forth, and the native people ran for the woods. They needed to take cover. Well, the trees were being just destroyed by these guns. And many of the native people, and there were 27 who died that day, 27. 27 of them, many of them were killed by splinters of wood that hit the trees, when the shells hit the trees, and the trees just blew up. And so it was a pretty nasty battle. And one of the people on the captain's ship was killed. One of his name was Engelbrecht. And he was the very first naval personnel killed in the Pacific ever. So it happened right near here. The canoes were destroyed. All of the goods were destroyed. And they estimated that it was worth $2,000 in those days, which was quite a lot of money for that time. And a lot of that would have been trade goods like blankets. Blankets especially were just valued so much in that time. So the Lincoln had to surrender. They just were outgunned and were just being blasted. They had even, one of the chief who was killed, he was in the camp. He'd been hit by one of the shells nearby. It had broken both of his legs, and he was in a terrible situation. And two women from the group ran to help him. One of the women was shot in the back, and the other one helped to get him out of the way of the cannon, but he died eventually from his wounds. And when they surrendered, they were taken on to the USS Massachusetts all the way to Victoria. Now, Victoria is part of the British sphere of influence. The Tlingits who came from Alaska had come from Russian America. The Russians still owned that part of Alaska, and so the people of Victoria said, we have no jurisdiction over the native people from Russian America. So, because the captain, Swartwout, wanted to just dump them in Victoria and say good riddance, because they had surrendered and they gave them food and clothing and everything. But what they did is they worked out a compromise. And the compromise was, okay, we'll make sure they have enough food and water, whatever, and we will take them. This is what the Hudson Bay Company representative, and he was officially the head of the British interest there. He wasn't a government official, he was part of the private company, but they ran the show. And so off they went, and they got dropped in right at the edge of Russian America and got left off. And I have not seen anything exactly how they got home from there. They may have been given canoes and so forth, but it isn't clear. So we get to, excuse me.
Did you say that was 1856?
1856, yeah, 1 year before Colonel Ebey met his demise. And it was just at the end of the Yakima War. So on August 11th, 1857, we're going to sort of go a little further into time here. The threat from the native folks from the north increased. There were reports of large groups of northern Indians making their way south. and they were coming. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen, but the reports were very, again, scary because they were seeing large groups, 450 people in one group, another group over here. And people got very nervous in the area thinking, what's going to happen here, what's going on. So that was going out on the telegraph, the communal telegraph, wasn't telegraph. And everyone was scared. Some of the settlers from the island moved off the island altogether. They went back to Seattle, or some of them moved as far down as Oregon because of this impending scare. The Tlingit, like I said, were if you killed the chief, there needed to be revenge. And so their idea was to just kill a high-ass Tyee, is the way they called it, and that would settle the revenge debt for their chief. Now the people, the Tlingit were 1,000 miles away, and the clan of the chief said, we need to get a group to go back down south and exact our revenge. Well, I don't know what it is, but a lot of them didn't want to go. Maybe it was the 1,000-mile trip, I have no idea. But finally, a woman from his clan volunteered to get a group of her clansmen together. And so they came down, just a small group. It wasn't a major invasion or anything like that. And they made that 1,000-mile journey down and back. Originally, they were looking for Dr. Kellogg, because they had heard about him from the year before, that he was a very important official in the community. And he was as a doctor, since there were very, very few doctors at the time. Dr. Kellogg was off island at the time, so he was very lucky. They asked around on the island. They weren't a large group, so they weren't real imposing. They didn't scare people right away. Anyway, they happened to run into a man named Tom Hasty, and that's where our Hasty Lake connection comes in. And they said, is the man who owns that farm, is he a high official? Is he an important person? He said, yeah, he's a high-ass Tyee. And so not knowing what they were asking for, he was just, trying to make the conversation and not get killed, I guess. And so on the 11th of August, which is just a few days from now, they came from the beach, landed down there on Ebey's Landing, stashed the canoes, went up the little ravine, and made a commotion outside of the house. And Isaac Ebey heard that, and he heard his dog, Rover. Rover was a good watchdog, so he heard him barking. So he came out to see what was going on. And he saw the Northern Indians. I don't think they were a huge group. It was a small group. And he said, what do you want? And then two shots were fired. One probably hit him in the hand, and another may have hit him on his head, or at least up on the temple. And they said, we want you, in English. That's the way the record shows, that they said it in English, so they knew enough to communicate with him. And he immediately ran back around behind the house, opened the window, and told his wife and two sons and two visitors who were there with him to come get out the window and get out into the woods and try to escape. He went back to the front, and after everybody received, we don't really know exactly what happened after that. One of the women who was visiting him was a Mrs. Corliss, and her husband was a, let me make sure I get that right, he was a marshal, exactly, an area marshal, and his name was Corliss, C-O-R-L-I-S-S. And when she jumped out of the window, she kept going. She wasn't going to stop just in the woods. She ran to the next house down, and that was the home of Robert Hill. And I don't know, people who know the area even better than I do might have heard of the hills. I'm not sure where their cabin is. But anyway, there were four, in that hill house, there were four men who were sleeping there that night. And so she roused them, they got their guns, and they ran up to Isaac Ebey's house up on the top of the ridge there by the cemetery, and roused him. Winfield Ebey, who was Isaac's brother, lived there, so, and his parents lived there. So they got him and they went back down to the house, and they found Colonel Ebey's body there on the front steps without his head. And that was that was what they did. They when they killed an enemy, it's the same way for the native people who lived here. When they killed an enemy, they collected the head, and it was used in rituals later on. So they prepared the body for burial. They ran down to the beach to see where the Indians had gone, but they had already gone. They paddled away, and so they came back. Next morning, they made burial preparations, and they buried Isaac next to his first wife, Rebecca, who was buried behind the house. And also there was a little blockhouse behind the house. But things had happened so quickly that nobody utilized it that night. So we get into what happened after that. The word spread all through the Puget Sound area. People were terrified. People were angry. They immediately over in Port Townsend, they went out and they were some other northern Indians, different tribal groups, had nothing to do with Colonel Ebey, but they grabbed him, put him in shackles, and were going to hang him. And they just were going to say, we're going to make an example to all the northern Indians not to come around here and maraud anymore. Well, about 4 days later, the four in jail got out. They dug out from under the house, so they disappeared into the crowd, and I doubt if they ever came back either. But they took word back to their communities that the law, the people in legal control of the American territory, they were no longer welcome and would be repelled if they even came to the area. And so they were gonna, these 18 guys that they had captured, they were gonna make them hostages and say, well, we'll give up the hostages if you turn in the people who killed Colonel Ebey. Well, they didn't know what about that. They were probably from a different community and so forth. And so after the 18 escaped, they just dropped it. I mean, there was nothing they could do. Some years later, in 1859, a trader from the Hudson Bay Company, Charles Dodd, he was also a very good friend of the Ebeys. He went up to the village of Cake, and it's on the Kuprianof Island, one of the islands that had been named after a Russian explorer, and tried to barter for the head. And they were not willing to give up the head. So later on, some later, he went back again, and each time he went, he was putting his life in danger. These were not hospitable Indians to European settlers from America. Anyway, he finally did barter, and he got the scalp. And the scalp had the two ears attached. Sorry about that. So the scalp was never, for some reason, buried with Colonel Ebey. They actually, the family really were devastated after this tragedy. Some of them moved off to California. One of them took the scalp with her. Teresa Trebon, who is a local historian, professional historian, tried to track down some years ago what happened to the scalp. And it just, there wasn't any data to let her know that. So we're not even sure, she's not even sure of where Colonel Ebey is finally buried. Originally, he was buried right behind the cabin and next to his wife. At some point, the Ebey family gave the land at Sunnyside Cemetery to the town for a community cemetery, and they moved the headstones. But Teresa was never able to find any record of the bodies themselves being buried. And so what she was saying is, she thought it's the only way they're going to find out is if they ever have someone with some LiDAR to go over there behind the Ebey's house and see if there are some remains there. But after time and wood caskets, it's, they may find a skull or bone, but it's just, it doesn't look like anybody's going to really ever know. So we really don't know who's buried under those headstones in terms of Colonel Ebey. So now, yes.
So are you talking about the house that they were buried at was down by the Ferri house, or?
Yeah, it was eventually torn down, so it doesn't exist today, and it was located right behind the Ferri house, as well as there was a little stockade rather, that was built there too.
And was the Ferri house there at that time? No,
I don't think so.
that would have been
Yeah.
too soon, yeah.
His sons built the Ferri house?
I'm not quite sure. They might have. Yes, people are shaking their heads. That's what they've heard, yeah. Now we're going to come up to, for me and Judy, Lynn, another local historical person, and Patrick. We had a direct connection to this historical tale. In 2014, I was sitting at the desk right in this room here, and I got a phone call. It was this very pleasant woman's voice, and she says, my name is Dawn Jackson, and I want to come down and bring some elders from our organized village of Cake, and they want to visit your museum and so forth. And she says, you probably have never heard of us. And I said, everybody in Cookville has heard of you. I was exaggerating, obviously, but I was personally aware of that just because of my interest in the history. So they came down with 4 elders and 2 chaperones. They wanted to visit the slalom over there in Jamestown. I guess they wanted to mend some fences over there historically, and they had a grant from somewhere to do that. So they wanted to come over here, and what we did is we gave them a tour of the Ebey's house, Jacob Ebey's house, and that Ebey's house there behind the Ferri house. And so it was a wonderful visit. I learned a lot about understanding what happened from the other side. It wasn't just those bad Indians from the north came down and killed our good guy, It wasn't that simple. And what happened is they came over to our house for dinner, and we were expecting them, and they were late from the ferry, and they pulled up and they came to the door, and I went and answered the door, and I went to the door, and here was the eldest elder there. Her name was Vi Demert, and she says, "We come in peace." And it was so wonderful. I mean, we just hugged, After 157 years, that wound between their community and our community got some healing. And they didn't know, they arrived on the 11th of August, the exact date that Colonel Ebey got killed and they did not know that date.
Wow.
And it was like a little woo-woo here, folks. It was just amazing. And we had a wonderful visit. They didn't want to make a big public thing about it because they just wanted a private visit. And what we learned is they had the oral history of the incident of losing the 27 members of their community. And if you think about a community that's maybe 300 or 400, 500 people, 27 is a huge amount percentage-wise. So they still carried the grieving with them. I mean, there were times when Dawn, who was the chaperone, she went over there and just sort of meditated by herself. I mean, historically, they still carry the memory of those folks. And all of a sudden, you look at that and you say, that's a different way of looking at it than the history books. And, I learned that their culture had been there for 10,000 years. And that's how they worked out, how they kept people from going to war and wiping each other out. So like I had sort of I had an understanding. No, it's not the Haida attack. Anyway, so it was a real education for me, and I had to really look inside and evaluate what my own opinions were. And then they came back a year later, and they just slipped into town. People weren't even aware of it. And Jim and I had lunch with them down here on the wharf and everything. And her father came, and he was the chief of the tribe at the time. So we had a wonderful lunch, all sorts of stuff. We showed him the Jacob Ebey house, and I think he got into a discussion with one of the docents up there about that stuff, and she didn't know his relationship to this, and it got a little strange there for a little while. I was like, oh, we better be careful. It hit a nerve somewhere with both of them, and it was a great visit, though. We enjoyed it. So Judy was there when they came to visit, and she took some pictures, and I'm going to just send them around to people. You can have a look at them. So, Judy, did you have anything you wanted to share out of that meeting?
I learned a lot from you. Thank you, and I thought I'd learned a lot. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
Yes. Great research, Michael.
Thank you.
The only thing I have to add is that my son went to school here and was part of History Day, and he won his contest and was sent to Washington, D.C., where he was Dowd. He was the guy that went up and got the scalp.
Dodd, yes, Dodd, right.
Dowd?
Dodd, D-O-D-D.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he did some
Did a
research
historical
and-
reenactment.
and found out about the guy that went up and tried to get, and finally was successful. I thought he got the whole head, but just the scalp.
No.
And anyway, he won.
We had we had an archivist years ago who had seen a picture of a mask in a museum from the Midwest, and it was a Northwest Coast mask. So we wonder what it was doing back in the Midwest, and there was some discussions with them that it might have been originally from out here, and it might have been a Tlingit mask that used Captain Ebey as a model. In other words, it had blonde hair, or what their concept of a European settler was. Sarah tried to contact, but I think she lost contact with the person. So one of these days, I'm going to try to find out that more information, because that would be an incredible addition. Yeah. So at some point, somebody in the tribe parted with that trophy, war trophy. Yeah.
So the Cape people that came down, in their oral tradition, did they retain the story about Ebey as well as?
Yes.
I mean, so they knew it was in retaliation. I mean, they had a reason for doing it.
Right.
In terms of chief to chief, but they did know that.
I don't know how many details they had about it. We didn't really go into it with them when they were there. we were mostly trying to understand it was more of a cultural exchange, because we had all these wonderful conversations with the elders, you know, who still were, like I said, connected to that history. And for a long time, the cake the Haida were being blamed for that. And so somebody finally went to the cake.
Well, it's Teresa.
Oh, well, before Teresa even. There was an article in a paper in Alaska, and found out that it was the cake, and had documented it in a newspaper article. So that was a long time ago, but that article had been lost. You know, it hadn't been circulated down here very much. So it got, but Teresa Trebon is the one that did the best and longest research on this whole issue.
In the university, Seattle, University of Washington archives. That's where she got it.
Right. I don't know if you know Teresa Trebon. She was the historian who did a lot of work here. She wrote the history of the Methodist Church here in, I think she did in the hospital. And she worked for the Swinomish tribe as their tribal historian for many years. Any questions? Gotcha.
Just a quick sidebar on young Thomas Hasty, based on a transcription of one of his descendants. He was a young teenage boy working for Isaac out in the field that day. And if you've seen pictures of Tlingit in full war dress, which may have been wearing, they're very, very intimidating and very scary. So if he was confronted by this group, I'm sure he did you know what. So, but he did point out where the cabins were, and interestingly enough, and Lee knows this too, up at the Skagit County History Museum up there in McConnor, there's a woman that I met up there that works up there, a volunteer, who's a Hasty descendant. And she told me, and I think she told you too, Lee, right? That she had all these Hasty documents, family Hasty documents and stuff. And but no one was interested, none of the, you know, her kids, nobody wanted them, no one was interested in them. I said, well, gee whiz, you know, I volunteered down at the History Museum in Coopville, we'd love to have them. And I probably should contact her again. We didn't make a connection. Anyway, that's just a little sidebar about young Thomas Hasty.
Yeah, what you were saying about the how they were dressed, if you have seen pictures of the Haida, they were so prepared for war, they even had made wooden armor and wooden helmets to go to battle. I mean, they really were serious, whereas the people down here, I mean, they would just go, you know, with it was very few clothing at all, but the Haidas were very into presentation in terms of animal hats and totems and everything, and just covered. They were so fierce that they were one of the reasons why the Russians left Alaska. There were three reasons that I've seen written, and that one of them was that this constant pushback from the Tlingits was so, and they actually won some battles with the Russians, and the Russians just sort of said, you know, we're not making a lot of money out of this deal here, you know, and we keep having the Tlingit attack our forts, and you know, they attacked the Tlingits back too. I mean, it was a give and take war kind of thing, but they were part of the reason why the Russians left Alaska and were willing to sell it for $7 million. Yes.
If I could just mention real quickly, you mentioned the Chimichum over on the peninsula who had been attacked and a lot of people killed by Chief Seow. There has been in the last few years sort of a rebirth of the Chimichum community over there, including a book. I don't know whether you have the book in the store here, but
Right.
there's a new book of photographs of Chimicum descendants from today, these spectacular black and white, life-size photos, and they are up on exhibit at Fort Gordon in the Commons through September.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
it's really, really wonderful. Still Here, I think is the name of the book.
Still here. Okay, we should write that down.
I
yeah.
will, I've got a copy at home and I'll bring it.
Oh, that would be great.
Of Chimicum people, descendants. So the Jamestown Slalom story is that they were all killed, that they're all gone. They were all killed, they're all gone, but they're not all gone.
But they're not, yeah.
And so these are Chimicum people that are reclaiming their, I mean, they've been there, but they're connecting more. And the Chimicum language and the Quileute language are basically the same, and is a totally different language from all the other Coast Salish languages around here. And so there's a direct
Right.
connection from La Push, Quileute to Chimicum over there, and the Chimicum folks are now learning Quileute. I mean, they're sort of being taken under the wing of the Quileute tribe, and so there's a really
Yeah.
interesting story going on.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds wonderful. Patrick.
Oh, I just want to mention one other thing you may be aware of. I think Lee found it. This was a sketch of the cabins and the recollection of Elmira, who was the daughter of Mary Evie Bozard, who was sister of Isaac. And it's a sketch of the cabins,
Right.
and with a her detailed, she was a young girl at the time, her detailed recollection of who went where, which window they went out of, which door they came in, where they went around. So Lee found, I don't know where you found that.
Ron Van Dyke.
I was
Ron
about to say
Van
Ron
Dyke.
Van Dyke had that.
So
Yeah.
we blew
No
it up.
surprise
We
there.
blew it up in a,
Really?
in a large, and it's up at, I laminated it, put it up at the, on the bulletin board in the Ebey house.
Oh, great, great.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was doing the research, I mean, I've been interested in this topic for years, all the way back to 2010 when Roger Sherman, my brother-in-law, was interested in this, and we were trying to find information about the cake and so forth. And that's what sort of got me interested in this story. And then the cake come and visit us, you know. So it was just like, you know, and we still communicate a bit with the family there. And the chief has changed, but his daughter Dawn, who was the one that came with the group of elders, she still is the sort of administrator of the village. It's called the Organized Village of Cake, and it's in Alaska. They didn't have reservations like we did in the main part of the United States. It's more organized around smaller municipalities or villages or so forth under another legal arrangement with the government. So that's why we didn't understand the Organized Village of Cake, what that meant, until she explained it.
Don't you want to go up there?
Can I?
We were gonna go, but I got sick. I had my brain bleed. They invited us up. If we were to call,
Yeah.
they would say, come and visit. They would say that right away.
I also have a story about cake, if I could quickly share,
Sure.
which is, so, as many places, there were some boarding schools built in Alaska for assimilating and, you know, taking the native people away from their communities and stuff. There was a boarding school in Cake that was built by Quakers. I'm a Quaker. And so my connection is through Quaker communities. So, and then it was taken over by Presbyterians. Anyway, come up to the present day, and there are some Quaker folks in Alaska working towards bringing healing and connection and reparation.
Mhm.
And so they ended up doing an apology thing, which they got contacted by people from Cape who wanted money to build a healing center. And Quakers raised $95,000 or $97,000 for the community towards the building of this healing center,
Right.
towards healing the trauma of the generations from the boarding schools and all of that, so.
Well, they're still
Just,
going. Yeah,
so, and this just happened a year, 2 years ago.
no
And the
kidding.
Quakers built a boarding school.
The Quakers ran boarding schools like
I didn't
so
know
many.
that.
Where is Cake?
Cake is about 95 miles south of Juneau. And it's on an island the Russians named Kuprianov Island. And I don't know a lot about it. I've seen pictures of it. It's very, very isolated. I mean, there are no roads. You go by Alaska State Ferry, and you go to their village, and the ferry pulls up, and all the supplies and the groceries and everything come through ferry, and they've lived there isolated for quite a long time. We had a woman here who lived here. She's recently died last year, Mary Young, who was a neighbor of Ron Van Dyke, actually. Her parents ran a cannery in Cake for many years, and she had a whole album of photos taken at the time, which we had reproduced here at the museum and got to them. So they had these pictures of, you know, great-great-grandpa so-and-so from the 20s and the 30s. So the connections are still going on, so I think that's wonderful. Are there any more questions or comments anybody would like to say?
Is there, I know there are several books in the library that do espouse the different theories of the past. Are you writing a new?
No,
Updated?
I'm more of a history buff. I mean, I have other, if I was going to write something, I have some other history I'm really
Yeah.
supposed to be writing. I've been told to write, but it wouldn't be about Cake, because I mean, even when I was doing this research, and I've been collecting books over the years, you know, about the whole incident. There's still discrepancies in the stories. Even some people that were there, it's like the discrepancy of two people that were there and knew what was going on firsthand, and they had different, you know how stories get told. So, you know, I've probably changed the story today, God knows, you know, or I've added something for, you know, I mean, it's just really without a record, and it's like, you know, Teresa finally got to the point, he says, we'll never know, we'll just never know. And it's amazing that it's gotten as far as it has, I mean, really.
We know it's not hiding.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a marker down on the beach there that has still, somebody should probably put a little other marker.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Until a couple years ago.
Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed doing this research and I appreciate your support.